Hello and welcome to Esther's Gardening Adventures. I'm Esther, and I know we're in the beginning of summer and planting for next year is probably the farthest thing from your mind. But there are some things you can start doing now to prepare for the winter sowing season for your crops for next year that will make your life easier further down the road. So let's get to it. But first, if this is your first time hearing about winter sowing, it's basically the process of growing seedlings for your spring and summer garden. But instead of growing them indoors under grow lights, you grow them outside in milk jugs and soda bottles and things like that over the winter and early spring. And basically it's just a different process, and actually it's much more low maintenance than the indoor seedling growing. So I definitely recommend you check out my Winter Sowing 101 series, which I'll provide a link to at the end of this if you're interested in learning more about it. But if you're familiar with the winter sowing process or you've done it before, this video can also be useful to you. So just about everything you can see behind me has been winter sown. From the lemon balm that's going bonkers to the zinnias. There are one or two plants in my garden, and maybe like a half dozen of the total have been grown from direct sowing, or a few starts that I got from the box store. But the vast majority of my flower bed and my vegetable beds are from winter sowing. And this coming year will be my third year doing the process. So I thought that now that I've sort of got it under my belt, I can offer you some suggestions. The first thing you can start doing now to prepare for your winter sowing year or your season is you can start collecting the kinds of containers you're going to use. Often in the last 2 years now, luckily my parents actually use a lot of water bottles and milk bottles, and so they provide those to me. But in my first year, I struggled quite a bit to come up with enough containers. And in fact, I actually ended up going to a store and buying, water bottles, big gallon water bottles, just for the sake of having bottles to winter sow. And really that kind of is counterintuitive. I mean, it's not horrible to do if you're desperate, but it's kind of counterproductive, because the idea of winter sowing, one of the beautiful things about it is you're preventing those plastic products from ending up in the waste stream of our recycling and our trash piles and other things a little bit longer than they would normally be. And so if you can start saving the ones you're using now, that can be really helpful. One tip though is, so if you're going to be saving milk bottles, milk jugs, make sure to rinse them out thoroughly, maybe even swirl a little bit of soapy water in them before you store them for this winter. Otherwise you'll have a pretty smelly, nasty, you can still use them, but it just isn't very, it stinks. Literally, it's stinky. The other thing to do with that is that you may be wondering, what kind of bottles can I use? And I have a video on that, but in the Winter Sowing 101 series. But basically, the rule of thumb is the container needs to be tall enough for the plant to be able to grow past the initial seedling stage. It needs to be tall enough for the plant to grow its first 2 or 3 sets of true leaves before you transplant, with exception to maybe like kale and things that can be transplanted pretty young. If you're growing something short like lettuce or things that don't need a lot of height, you can potentially use shorter containers, but I have seen people in the winter sowing groups on Facebook that I'm a part of say that it has been problematic for them, and so it's really not ideal if you can avoid it. To have something that doesn't have enough space for them to grow above where you're going to put the soil. The other thing you can do when you are saving containers is they need to be able to let the sunlight in to feed the plants. And so you will need a container that doesn't have to be fully transparent, doesn't have to be fully clear or see-through, but it needs to let the light through. And one way to test it is to hold the bottle up towards the sun, and if you can see the light coming through, then you know that it'll be okay for winter sowing. So those are a couple things that can help you in knowing what to save. And that can include soda bottles, juice bottles, gallon milk jugs and water jugs, those giant pretzel containers, all kinds of things, anything that you can drill holes in the bottom of and, you know, put soil in. But I hope that helps. Okay, number 2 thing you could start doing right now, and this is sort of a part 2 and 3. Part 2 is one thing I have noticed that in the winter, the big box stores and even the nurseries really don't increase their inventory of potting soil or of different components you would do if you made your own potting soil. And so it might not hurt right now to go and get a bag of your favorite potting soil. And remember, you don't want seed starting mix, because seed starting mix does not have the nutrients the plants will need to go beyond the initial seedling stage. So you want to get potting soil that has some good compost in it. And I do recommend organic, but you know, it's up to every person what you do. And I don't have a particular potting soil I recommend. And the reason for that is if you watched my last live stream, you'll see I talked about how I've heard gardeners mention that, and I think it's a fair point, that these companies over the years change who their suppliers are for their potting mix, and also what the suppliers use for their ingredients when they supply the ingredients to the companies that put the potting mix together. And so while there might be a brand that's really great one year, the next year it may not be that awesome. So the best you can do is pay attention to what they say are in the ingredients, pay attention to whether it's organic or not, if that's a priority for you, and you know, try to get something that you can afford to the extent you can. The other thing is, and this is sort of, I guess this is sort of a part 4 of that potting mix option. If you've been doing winter sowing in the past, or if you're used to making your own potting mix, now is also the time. In fact, earlier this year would probably be better, but now you may still have time to get the individual components you will need to make your own potting mix for winter sowing. And the kinds of things you'll need is 2 to 3 different types of compost. I tend to like to do the leaf grow that the state provides, which is about $4 a bag. And then I will usually do like a mushroom compost, or there's a Coast of Maine, which is like seashell type compost type stuff that I like. But basically whatever 2 to 3 different composts you can find, because each compost is a little bit different. And then you need something to help keep the soil nice and fluffy. So you can use perlite or vermiculite. And coarse vermiculite is what some people recommend, but I use regular perlite and vermiculite and it works fine. And then the third component you need for that mix is some coconut coir or some peat moss. Both of those kind of help retain the moisture in the container. Peat moss is not as environmentally friendly, but it is easier to find in most stores. Coconut coir is definitely more sustainable, although it can be more expensive, but if you can source it now, it's a good time to do it. Another thing to know is that when you go to put all your components together for your potting mix, for your potting soil, you're going to do 1 part compost of those different types of compost. So several types of compost, 1 part of that, combined ingredients, 1 part of your soil fluffer, you know, your perlite or vermiculite, and 1 part of your moisture retaining product. And that is your coconut coir or your peat moss. So you can do, that's how you break it up. You can also, if you want to put in, if you're nervous about it, you can also put in some slow release organic. Don't use the non-organic for this one because it can actually hurt the plant in the long term. But you can do like some slow release fertilizer components, like a little sprinkle of that in the mix if you want to, so that in case there's some component you're missing. But really, you should have enough in there for the plant to be good to go. I do recommend, just because we don't know where it's coming from, I do recommend avoiding at the beginning any animal-based, especially cow or horse manure-based compost, unless you know where it's coming from, like if you're getting it from someone local, because a lot of times the hay is sprayed, when it's growing, the hay is sprayed with a herbicide that actually hurts broadleaf plants, and that gets passed through the digestive tract of the animals and can really stunt the growth of your plants. And so I've had some trouble with that with some of my plants this year, and I'm trying to stay away from that for my big leafed plants like tomatoes and things like that. So I hope that that tip will help you as well. And just, you know, maybe buy 1 bag of each thing, 1 cubic feet to 2 cubic feet of each thing. And when you go to make your mix in January or February, when you start your winter sowing process, you won't have to scrounge around and go store to find the things you need, or pay exorbitant prices to buy it online. So it's not a bad idea. Now, not everybody has storage space, and I get that. So if you can't do that, that's okay. But if you have the space to store those kinds of things, now is a good time to get them. And then the 5th thing I will recommend is, and this is sort of something you can do now or you can wait till later, it's not absolutely necessary. And that is to go through if you haven't already, you know, I just now threw out the last of the winter sowing jugs that didn't sprout. But you can go through your last year's, if you winter sowed last year, go through your containers and figure out which ones are good enough to keep. You may have thrown them all in a pile together. You may have thrown them in your shed or thrown them in bags in the basement. It doesn't hurt to look through them and kind of rifle through them now. And if you want to rinse them out now while the weather's still good, you can do that. Now, if you're in a drought area or high heat area and doing that step is too much, then don't do that right now. But it's something you can do in advance of the process, although the timing of it isn't quite as important as the other 4 things I mentioned. And then there's the fun one, which is sort of a bonus, which is to think about get out your journal and think about what went right this year with winter sowing. What were some lessons learned? What would you like to do differently next year? Are there any plants that did extremely well that you definitely want to do again next year? So you can just think through the process. And it doesn't hurt to tinker around with it a little bit, but I definitely recommend sticking mostly with the process that I've recommended and some others have recommended in some of the winter sowing groups I'm in. All right. So that's it for this video. I hope you are having a wonderful summer. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed it, please hit the like button. If you aren't already a subscriber, please consider doing so. And otherwise, I'll see you next time.